The Guardian.
The Guardian Books Podcast with Claire Armistead.
I think happiness is a level of contentment that exists within a person, so that basically on any given day they walk around feeling like everything's okay in my world, the world's an okay place. It really is that old adage about I'm okay and you're okay.
Things do not touch the soul. Our perturbations come only from the opinion which is within. Marcus Aurelius.
Forgiveness is the primary tool to achieving happiness. It is the bridge back to happiness, because when we are in an unforgiving state and we are carrying a resentment towards someone, there's a great metaphor. It's as if we're holding a bat over our head and we're hitting ourselves with that bat.
Ask yourself whether you are happy, and you cease to be so. John Stuart Mill.
There are lots of ways of being miserable, but there's only one way of being comfortable, and that is to stop running around after happiness. Edith Wharton.
Think positive, be happy, smile. It may never happen. If that's your approach to life, then it, in the form of any number of calamities, real or imagined, may well happen. If, on the other hand, you're rather more tempered in your expectations, you're likely to end up a whole lot more contented. That, at least, is the contention of the latest book from Oliver Burkeman, The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. Oliver's here with us in the studio now. Hello, Oliver.
Hi.
With a smile on your face.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Our second guest is a philosopher who's made practical and theoretical use of his own youthful experience of anxiety and unhappiness. He's Jules Evans. He runs the Wellbeing Project at the Centre for the History of the Emotions at London University's Queen Mary College. It's a bit of a mouthful, Jules. And is co-organiser of the London Philosophy Club. His book, Philosophy for Everyday Life and Other Dangerous Situations, argues for a return to the examined life, as proposed by the Greek philosopher Socrates more than 2,000 years ago. Now, these books are both hot off the press, so I wondered if you could in turn start by actually laying out your stall, both for each other and for readers. So, Oliver, tell us about this antidote of yours.
Oh, this book starts from the position, I guess, that there's something problematic about the messages of relentless positive thinking and of the importance of being optimistic at all costs that I think suffuses the culture, comes at us from the self-help industry and from lots of other places as well. So it's really mainly, apart from a little bit of a look at why I think that doesn't work, it's mainly the stories of my adventures as a journalist among philosophers and psychologists and other people who take the alternative view, which I call in the book the negative path to happiness. The idea that it's through embracing failure, uncertainty, insecurity, sometimes even pessimism, death, that a deeper kind of happiness, but also success in a more worldly sense, awaits. This idea that self-help is a sort of narrow little corner of the publishing industry that you have to sort of shuffle around and buy books when nobody's looking, that's exactly not how it's been through centuries and centuries of philosophy.
OK, well, at that point, I'm going to move on to Jules. Jules, run us briefly through your philosophy for everyday life.
So it's about how people use ancient Greek and Roman philosophy today. And people always ask me, do you mean consciously? I mean, yes, consciously. People who consciously use techniques for living better from the Stoics or Epicurus or Plato or Aristotle. I got into it because I had depression and anxiety in my late teens and early 20s. And came across cognitive behavioural therapy, which is today the most, I would guess, scientifically credible form of therapy. It's one of the few forms of therapy you can get on the NHS. And that helped me a lot, and I just wondered where it had come from. And I went and interviewed the inventors of it, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, as Oliver did, in fact, as well. Oliver was there a few months before me, and discovered that they'd been directly inspired by ancient Greek philosophy. So as Oliver says, these ideas from ancient Greek philosophers are both incredibly practical, and there's now this scientific evidence base for them that cognitive behavioral therapy has provided. And I spent this wonderful 20s rediscovering all this stuff and reading it and absolutely loving it. And then finding people who'd used it in their lives and hearing their stories. People who'd often been through much worse situations than me. I interviewed the first female prisoner of war in the US Army, or a guy whose parents had been meth addicts and so on, and just how philosophy had helped them in that kind of intense laboratory of human experience.
You structure your book as a meal with the various different philosophers representing courses.
That sounds cannibalistic. It starts off with the School of Athens, Raphael's fresco. And I guess probably at some subconscious level I was inspired by Jamie Oliver's Dream School. And I remember I didn't watch it, but I saw that poster on the tube. And I thought, that's a great idea, you know. And so I was imagining that with the ancient philosophers as teachers, teaching us, you know, the art of living. So Epictetus teaching us how to maintain control amid chaos. Epicurus teaching how to savour and enjoy the moment. So it's that kind of idea, done in a slightly cute fashion.
Now, both of you are very big on Stoicism, particularly big on Epictetus, who you've just mentioned. Oliver, what does he mean to you?
I'm picking out a certain thread that I think connects the ancient stuff to stuff at every different stage. That's all by way of preface, to say that what I focus on in terms of the Stoics in my book is this idea of the premeditation of evils, of focusing on how badly things could go.
Which translates as negative visualization these days, does it?
Fleshing out in vivid detail how badly things could turn out in order, firstly, to prepare yourself, secondly, to lessen anxiety by understanding that however badly they could go, they're not going to go infinitely badly, which was one of Albert Ellis's most favourite points, and finally to sort of enhance your gratitude and appreciation for the fact that you do have what you have at the moment anyway.
You see it as a sort of negative capability, don't you, in your book, Oliver? Whereas, Jules, your book is all about finding the power within oneself to change oneself. That seems to me to be a fundamental difference between these two books.
I think Oliver's exploring a particular approach, an approach that's quite different to the mainstream. And I'm kind of looking, I would say, at a plurality of approaches and criticising them all, really. He's right that we live in an over kind of optimistic era, and I think I also read a book that you referred to, Tali Sharot's The Optimism Bias, and thought there was something wrong with that book, in that it was saying, you know, 75% of the population are optimistic, and that's good, and if you're in that 25% who aren't, you're basically mentally ill.
I'm intrigued, Oliver, that you talk about Albert Ellis and your visit to him without once mentioning the three-letter word CBT, or the acronym. Why? I mean, he founded CBT, according to Jules, is that right? Is that what his central importance is?
I wanted to look at Albert Ellis's contribution specifically in the ways that he was influenced by the Stoics, and I think that actually cognitive behavioural therapy draws its influences from a whole lot of different places. I actually think that some cognitive behavioural therapists, although Albert Ellis was not guilty of this, actually engage in a kind of positive thinking that is part of what I'm suggesting is the problem. The idea that you can always or should always focus on changing your problematic thoughts. Actually, I think sometimes there's quite a good counter-argument to be made that CBT can sort of promote this idea you've got to rigorously manipulate your mental and emotional conditions.
Jules, what do you say to that?
I think maybe we did the last two interviews with Albert Ellis. He kind of brought this stuff from philosophy into psychotherapy and really connected these two worlds of philosophy and therapy. And we're still working out, you know, that dialogue and that connection. When you meet him and research him, you discover this fascinating intellectual heritage to CBT. People think CBT is some very shallow new thing from California that doesn't have any of the kind of cultural credibility that psychoanalyst does.
Tell us
Sigmund
what
Freud
it is,
does.
just for people who don't know what it is. What is it?
Sure, okay. It's the idea that our emotions are caused by our beliefs or attitudes. It was inspired by this quote of Epictetus's, men are disturbed not by events, but by their opinions about events. So to change your emotions, you have to become aware of your interpretation of a situation of events, your beliefs, your values, which are often unconscious and automatic. They just flash through your head. So first of all, you have to bring them into your consciousness. And then you can examine them, see if they make sense. And if they don't, choose to see a situation differently. So actually, it doesn't take years and years of dream analysis or hypnosis. You can just learn to ask yourself questions in order to bring your unconscious assumptions into consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then change them.
Oliver, you had a Stoic moment or a sort of CBT insight in a supermarket queue.
I recount that in the book just because it's the most sort of laughable example of an irrational belief, or what Albert Ellis would call an irrational belief.
And you actually corrected yourself, so you stopped feeling frustrated in the supermarket queue.
Well, I mean, this is my sort of, I guess my reservation with some of the CBT stuff is, yes, that was very easy, but the whole point of including that anecdote was how minor it was. It was a very, very small, silly thing, and it was, in the circumstances, extremely straightforward to say, okay, actually, nothing bad has happened to me or can happen to me as a result of this situation. Therefore, it is not rational to have this emotional distress. The issue, I think, where I have problems sometimes with the way that cognitive behavioural therapy seems to be delivered, and certainly with the way that it's simplified into a lot of self-help books, is it really recruits the therapist into the patient's ideas about what their problem is. The problem with short-term approaches like this, I think, you go somewhere, you say, my problem is X, and then you're given a set of solutions and tools for dealing with your problem. And I think a lot of more traditional talk therapists would probably say, I'm sort of slightly guessing, but I think is part of the point of therapy is to create a space where other issues can bubble up, and maybe what you need to do what a therapist needs to do with a client sometimes is to not assume that their immediate analysis of what their problem is the right analysis, and that all they need is a quick set of tools for solving it.
And I think, the problems with it, I think, are similar to the problems with Stoicism. It's basically, if you're emotionally disturbed, just adjust your beliefs and then carry on. Mm-hmm. So it's all inner work. A lot of your beliefs might come from your culture. Your culture might be what's making you sick, or your economy, or your crazy society. But in the Stoic version, you create an inner citadel of rationality and serenity. This kind of little fortress. And then just carry on, without really trying to change your society. Though the Stoics were quite political and politically engaged, but CBT has some of those problems as well. You just change the thoughts in your head and then go back to capitalist society and to your job stacking shelves or something. And I think some cognitive psychologists say that cognitive therapy has become too atomized and individualized, and we've lost the sense that our beliefs also are a part of our culture. You shouldn't just be focusing on changing yourself, but also perhaps changing your society as well. It remains the case that the best predictor of depression is actually poverty. So, of course, there's a connection between our circumstances and our inner beliefs and values.
Now, Jules, I want to just move this slightly off this, because there is one thing in your book that I found quite disturbing, which is you reference an awful lot of US military stuff. Mm-hmm. And in particular, you talked to Rhonda Cornum, who was the surgeon you mentioned who was captured by the Iraqis, who is now in charge of comprehensive soldier fitness, which the Pentagon's been rolling out for the last couple of years, which has been described as the largest deliberate psychological intervention in history. Now that sends shivers down my spine.
So they're trying to reduce the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder and this epidemic of soldier suicides. I think suicides have killed more troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, American troops, than in active service, than enemy bullets. And the way they're trying to do that is they launched this mass resilience training program designed by Martin Seligman, who's the inventor of positive psychology. And it takes some of these ideas from CBT and from ancient philosophy about trying to teach people to be more conscious of how they're interpreting situations, and how some interpretations can make a situation worse and others can make it stronger. They've taught similar things in English schools, some of these resilience training techniques. They provide CBT now in job centres as well, in old people's homes, so in all kinds of different areas. I like the fact that CBT is now far more available in the UK, because I think it helps people. But it's when you're trying to tell them how to think, tell them what the right way is to think, when it becomes too much of a dogmatic science. So this US Army program claims to be able to measure soldiers' spiritual fitness, for example, using a questionnaire.
That is just extraordinary, isn't it, Oliver?
There's the whole anti-psychiatry movement of a few decades past that sees the whole notion of psychotherapy in all sorts of contexts as basically a way of fitting people to our insane society. So I think you can always find that critique. It's an important one, but it's on a slightly different level.
Both Oliver and I came into this stuff as free consenting adults who chose to kind of try out some of these ideas. Whilst this is like non-consensual, every soldier has to do it. So it's prescriptive philosophy. And the Stoics themselves were quite wary of that. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, said, you can't force this kind of stuff on people. All you get is feigned subjection and grudging assent, or feigned assent and grudging subjection.
I talk about some work in research work in the psychology of thought suppression, and the idea about how difficult it is to decide to not think something. That actually, when you say in the classic exercise, don't think of a polar bear for 2 minutes, the reason that you fail when you try to do that is because of how hard you're trying. And it's that sort of ironic pattern that I think goes all the way through a lot of this stuff, the stuff that doesn't work, and it's finding a way to reverse that pattern or get around it that is the key to all sorts of successful approaches to happiness. They don't involve trying really, really hard to be happy.
On a lighter note, Jules, your travels take you to the philosophy pubs of Liverpool.
Yeah, I just was there this weekend as well. There's been this grassroots growth of philosophy clubs in the last 10 years, particularly since the internet has enabled people to kind of find each other and get together. One part of that is this movement called Philosophy in Pubs, which was started by three working class men in Liverpool, one of whom was the former president of the Communist Party here in Britain, one of whom was a teacher in the Workers' Education Association, getting people into pubs just to reflect on ideas in a Socratic way. And it's been a huge success. There are now like 16 philosophy in pubs groups just around Merseyside. So it's kind of like the grassroots capital of philosophy in Europe. And there are also another 30 or so around the country. There's about 700 on Meetup, just all over the world. There's Skeptics in the Pub. There's London Philosophy Club, which is the one that I organise. There's psychology in the pubs. There's art history in the pubs. They used to call cafes in the 18th century penny universities. You go in, you pay your penny for entry, and you might be sat next to Newton or whoever, and you just can talk about the latest plays or whatever. As formal higher education is kind of in trouble and running out of money, people are finding all of these informal ways to get together and discuss ideas and share information and stuff. I find it very optimistic.
Here on Guardian Books, that's exactly the sort of discussion we're always trying to encourage. So, if you've come to us through iTunes, you can join the discussion by adding your comments below this podcast at guardian.co.uk/books. And if you haven't already, do subscribe on a regular basis to all the rich material we'll be offering you in our weekly Guardian Books podcast over the next few weeks. For example, next week we have a special series with Madeline Bunting, who's travelled around Britain to talk to the likes of Robert Macfarlane, Alice Oswald and Rachel Lichtenstein about literature and landscape.
Scientists have recently found happiness. I mean, the actual physical source of happiness.
Pessimism, when you get used to it, is just as agreeable as optimism. Arnold Bennett.
There are good reasons to believe that the whole notion of seeking happiness is flawed to begin with. For one thing, who says happiness is a valid goal in the first place? So wrote Barbara Ehrenreich in her 2010 book Smile or Die, How Positive Thinking Fooled America and the World. The novelist Joanna Kavenna has picked a story of a woman escaping from a collapsed marriage by dropping out in the countryside. Her new book is called Come to the Edge. With bankers brazenly fiddling the figures all the way to financial crisis, Kavenna's narrator gets drawn into a plot to strike back at the glaring inequalities made manifest by the palatial second homes in a remote Cumbrian valley. But can you find happiness by taking matters into your own hands? Here's a section she read to Richard Lee.
That night, Cassandra goes round to Beckfoot Cottage to make the necessary arrangements, as she calls them with a sudden talent for euphemism. She goes with a brick and a wrench, and I follow her, protesting all the way. Don't do this. You really don't have to do this. I don't think you should do this. At the low stones, I say no, and as we pass the Quaker burial ground, I say no, and under the big yew tree, I say no. Then the cock crows, and suddenly I'm Peter, is that right? But there's no cock crowing anyway, and besides, Cassandra just ignores me and keeps walking up the hill, and I keep stumbling along behind her nonetheless. Despite my efforts in naysaying, I am still there behind her, tagging along. When we arrive, Cassandra smashes a downstairs window with the brick and clears the glass away with the wrench. The shattering glass really rings around the valley, and I hear a dog barking somewhere. We're quiet for a few minutes, and then Cassandra goes in. I stay outside. I am the coward trembling by the gate. There's a full moon, and it's so bright you can see every blade of grass. There's a high wind, and the night is full of ominous noises, creaks and clatters that make me want to turn and run. Then Cassandra comes out through the front door. "We're in luck," she says. She's holding a set of keys.
So, what drove you over the edge?
Well, I was living in the Duddon Valley. I mean, I should start by saying this clearly isn't autobiography, otherwise I would be talking to you from my prison cell. But I was living in the Duddon Valley in this very wild, beautiful place, in a very crumbling, insubstantial cottage where the wind rattled at the windows and you kept feeling the whole place would just give up entirely against these enormous, forceful elements. And I suppose, like everybody else there, in fact, never had any money. There was this whole economy of people living hand to mouth, and they had it much worse than I did because they'd lived there for generations, and all the economies and industries had obviously been taken out of the valley gradually. And we used to walk around this village all the time, and you'd bump into locals. Oh, and we were living in the grounds of an abandoned school, that was the other thing, and they took it very bad, of course, because within living memory, the last generation had all gone to this school, and the thing was decaying before their eyes. But you'd walk around the village and you'd bump into these locals and you'd talk. And you'd always be standing outside these incredible, beautiful, empty houses, the biggest houses in the valley. And they were always empty. And literally they'd been empty for years. And so you'd have these, you'd just pass the time of day. But there was this weird shadow of another world, this completely other world of, you know, the super rich, I guess, of people who bought things and just left them, didn't need them.
Beautifully turned out mansions that are never used for anything at all.
Yes, exactly. And so I suppose gradually that started to really grind away at me until I sort of had this idea of what would happen, and sort of in general, what happens if you whack people too hard with iniquity and unfairness, if you just keep smacking them again and again with just blatant injustice. What happens? Do they finally go over the edge? And I thought it would be interesting to watch two characters, the narrator and Cassandra White, who I just read about, really going over that edge. And almost it's kind of the view from the fall. You know, as you go down, what do you say and what do you think?
It's the thing when you take the law into your own hands. When you go far enough, the law doesn't pay any attention to you anymore. If you are extreme enough, you just start getting away with things. Yes,
and also I suppose there's this thing about remote communities, and it's a double-edged sword. One of my early books was all about the far north and very much the Ice Museum, and very much that was about as soon as people discovered this remote place, the Arctic, they started filling it with secrets and industrial debris and using it as a Cold War staging post. And I think in the Lake District, you know, at the edge of Britain, you have that amazing national park, which is beautiful and carefully regulated. And then you have the coast where there's Sellafield and the nuclear submarine building programme and a lot of industrial debris just left there. And I think there's that idea that you can exploit remote areas, you know, because there aren't lots of voters and, you know, people don't generally rise up. And so I suppose there was also that sense that not only have they been kicked in the head because of that, but also when they do start going over the edge, yes, as you say, at first no one notices at all because this valley is so far away. And it's only when they become just so blatantly illegal that finally the authorities start to come into force.
Well, you have a lot of fun with them smashing their way into the houses and taking over. But your targets, they range from pettifogging legislation to the disconnect between the way that part-time countrysiders aren't really in the real countryside at all. They're in a parody of the countryside. But with bankers, as they are, fessing up to fixing things entirely, once again, your main targets couldn't be more timely. Did you start this as a kind of, in a paroxysm of rage over the crash?
Well, actually, I started it in 2007, I have to say.
Before?
So just before, I think Northern Rock had just foundered. But I think these forces, well, except for economists who seemed blissfully ignorant of them. But I think it was pretty obvious to people on the ground that this was totally unfair, and that, you had this unregulated property market. So you had a national park that was very regulated, and you could only build a certain number of houses. And then this mighty international unregulated property market bearing down on it. As you say, you had all this legislation about, saving wildlife and destroying, at the expense of humans, and sort of keeping places, of course, I think you should save wildlife, but there were people literally with nowhere to live. And so I think people knew on the ground that it was totally horrendous. And I think it just came as a surprise to a rich elite that were having a wonderful time.
Cassandra calls them perverts. Is it the unfairness that really riles you?
Well, I think really riles her. And I guess that's part of, I wrote it from my own sense of this total iniquity, and I couldn't have written it without this experience in the Lake District. But of course, then I wanted to have a character, Cassandra White, who just expresses the absolute truth of what she's feeling at all times. And she's so just disenfranchised that she has no incentive to play the game. And they start off in archetypes. There's a suburban housewife who's the narrator, who's sort of fallen on hard times, and she answers an advert to be Cassandra's lodger. And Cassandra looks like a sort of rustic widow, a kind of rural widow, another archetype. So I was partly playing with those and smashing them apart. And of course, Cassandra couldn't be less like a rural widow, and she's 6 foot tall and has, masses of sort of auburn hair everywhere, and, got these piercing green eyes, and she's completely implacable and forceful. And so I just wanted her to express this total lack of humbug that you can, again, if you're not attached to some institution that's sort of snuffing out your honesty. You're not part of some series of vested interests. I suppose the narrator finds that slightly horrifying and also really liberating, because, people do get lied to all the time. And so when someone's just really out there with the truth, it's quite funny. And that was, a lot of it is comic because she's so totally outrageous.
Yeah, the book's dedicated to the real Cassandra White. Is she drawn from life?
I did that partly as a sort of sly joke with myself, because there's always that thing of when you publish a book and people say, who is the real Cassandra White? And so I sort of thought, but I've known a lot of Cassandra Whites in my time. I think lots of people have. And I think we all have her within us, and that we all have a sort of person within us who's just completely hacked off and sort of outraged. But most people don't go as far as her. They don't start smashing stuff up, of course. And, it's a good job. And they don't start burning stuff down and all the things she gets up to.
Has writing the book changed you at all? Do you no longer lust after granite counters and satinwood card tables yourself?
But that's the thing, that I never had them. So again, the narrator is not remotely me. I suppose I was in that situation of having no money whatsoever in the lakes, and so being quite remote from the kind of property.
But do you feel her lust after the nice stuff?
I think I've sort of abandoned, if I ever had that lust, I've abandoned it. You make a choice if you become a writer of so-called literary fiction. I think you sacrifice any inner urge for a granite counter that you might ever have had, and you can't complain. You've made your pact with, a certain sort of impunity. So I don't think that she's an expression of my inner longing for a perfect glinting house, but I did want to take her out of that. It's more a sort of sadism that often happens with my characters, that I wanted to take her out of this supposed idyll and just strand her in a disgusting farmyard full of dirt and debris and the sort of real viscera of existence.
There's a lot about shit, isn't there? The smell, yes, the mud that pervades her.
Yes.
Is this renunciation? Is this other route rather than the kind of capitalist rat race? Is this the way to achieve happiness?
There's always ideals concocted. So there's an ideal of the countryside, which again I was trying to deal with quite a lot. That the second homeowners come for the weekend and it's very sacrosanct, and they obviously don't go and jump around in a load of sort of mulch. They're just there to look at the beautiful view. And of course, that's the other thing about the place. It's so incredibly beautiful. But if you're living there, of course, you deal with this. You're farming, or you're dealing all the time with a much grimier side of the country economy. And so that is, again, something you could miss. You could almost miss it from your view if you're just there briefly. But as soon as you live there and start to see what's really happening, what's really driving the place, then it's this constant engagement with dirt and debris and the sort of ritual decay and regeneration of nature.
So if Western turbo-capitalism isn't a viable route to happiness, and the rural idyll is just a mirage, is there a way that you can find happiness for yourself despite the world?
I think it's always that thing of, do you head for the hills and sequester yourself and stay with your friends and family and try to ignore it as much as possible, which is a kind of only partial option because you can't entirely, again, unless you're a member of the super rich, I guess. So you have to delve into the world around you. You have to sort of in some way engage with it. Or I suppose, do you make that kind of compromise with actuality that we all do, and so you try and retain something of yourself apart from it, and you, like, this book is partly about friendship as well, actually. So this idea that they do, Cassandra and the narrator, gain a lot from this friendship, and the narrator also kind of salves her whole love life disaster with a sort of positive encounter with a real man and so on. And so there's, which isn't a major part of the book, and I didn't want it to be, but there is a sort of sense that redemption in various forms of kind of human companionship is really meaningful and important.
So the relationships around you are a defence against the world which is set against you.
I think we're always being told what we are, and I think that's another thing that has become more and more untenable, that people are being told all the time, you are this, don't try and get above yourselves, just stay in your place. And there's a huge... Althusser, if we must, would call it interpolation, the way society calls you in a certain way and tells you what you are and how far you can go. And I think that stymies people's potential. But with the people you can actually be yourself, and you can kind of, create your own sort of community of reality, which is thereby regenerative and meaningful in some way. So I think it's a small, personal, but ultimately significant process, possibly. I mean, I don't speak as someone who thinks this should be in any way normative or generally helpful, but I suppose I would say that in my own experience of things, that's the thing that makes you happy.
Joanna Kavenna talking to Richard Lee there. Come to the Edge is published by Quercus. And if none of this has made you happy, do hang on for this weekend's Guardian review, which is sure to turn you pink with pleasure. Or perhaps that should be blue. We've got new erotica from 5 leading writers. You can read their stories, find out what their favourite sexy scenes from literature are, and see if you can identify the writers of 5 spicy scenarios. It's certainly not your usual review fare, but I can assure you it's all in the best possible literary taste. Until next week, from me, Claire Armistead, and my producer, Tim Maybe, goodbye.
Great downloads, go to guardian.co.uk/audio.